Chapter 14, Valiant Castle. Friday, 7:30 p.m., the Marble Square. Resident Resolve and Resident Leary were walking side by side towards the gushing fountain in the courtyard square. The Lady Doing Sun was on their backs. The strange breeze still continued to blow. It wound its way around the towers and softly played with Resident Leary and Resident Resolve's clothing and hair. The birds chirped cheerily in the tree overspreading the fountain, as if summing up the joy and relief all the residents felt at that time. Never had they been so united and collected on one point. Residents Resolve and Leary passed a former shivering resident adroit who was walking alone by himself. When he saw them, he rushed at them, babbling something they could not understand. Before he came very close, Resident Resolve said something that sent former resident adroit away very disheartened and shivering.
Behold, if anyone is in the king, he is a new creature. Old things have passed away, and behold, all things become new.
It is so strange, Resolve. I cannot understand adroit, rather ploy as well as I used to. I used to understand him with no problem at all, but when Resident Rye mentioned with obvious surprise that he could not understand the emissaries, I noticed I was having difficulty in both understanding and in hearing the spies. Yet this spy's speech now is garbled babble in my ear. It is like our language is changing, but how could that be? I think at the end of the day, the only explanation for this change is the plaques. How wonderful it is that with the plaques in our memory, or at least in yours, that you have a plaque for every difficulty.
Yes, I discovered that if I spoke a plaque out loud, these spies or bad character traits would cower back and leave me alone. If only I had done so when they were tossing us around like fruit, right before the emissaries intervened to help us. But this particular plaque I just mentioned is connected to the fact that you cannot understand, adroit as you once did. It is the work of Creator King. He is giving us a new heart, and as a result, you cannot understand these bad character traits as you did before. I think that may also be why he is shivering and sneezing, but you are right about the plaques being the catalyst for this wonderful change. I think that...
What is wrong, Resolve?
Look at the character trait really carefully.
What do you see, Resolve?
Something is out of the loop here. Why, I can see through part of him. Look at his tunic on the right side. I can just barely make out a brick in the wall that is beyond him.
Well, hey, I can see part of a brick through his tunic also. What does this mean?
At that moment, the breeze strengthened a little. As it did, former resident adroit pulled his cloak closer to him, and yet he still shivered. The part of the tunic that Residents Resolve and Leary could see was slowly widening to where they could see more of the brick through him.
Then it is not a rumor.
What is not a rumor, Resolve?
Well, something I did not bring up earlier was something Resident Aspire told Head Inspector Cautious. He said that a guard in Victor Castle mentioned that their spies or bad character traits were fading. Even I supposed it to be bogus at the time. Yet here we see it in front of us. Well, no, not now that he has just ran behind that tower. Yet this warm breeze is as steady as before.
Resident Rye said not too long ago that nothing would surprise him anymore. I am beginning to relate. I wish I had taken the invitation to read the plaques from Head Inspector Cautious seriously. But being young, I believed what others told me about the plaques being boring and restrictive. Now I am older, but I still do not understand them. I confess to being a little sad at not knowing them as well as you do.
Why, Larry, my friend, there's an antidote for that. Come with me, and we will study them together.
But I have procrastinated for so long. I'm afraid I won't understand it.
Resident Leary replied sadly, shaking his head in a droopy sort of way from side to side. He started to bite his fingernails.
Then I will help you, and we will study them together. We will learn about the king and what we don't know. We can find out, line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little, and in the right context, of course.
Resident Resolve replied, handing Resident Leary a small sandstone.
I heard that line upon line or passage or phrase before. Could you clarify it a little?
Well, what that means is that you have to study in the right way. For example, What do all the plaques as a whole have to say about one subject in particular? If the subject has to do with what happens when someone dies, don't pick just one reference to prove your point. If something is true, you're going to find references for it all over the plaques, not in just one or perhaps two places. See what the plaques as a whole have to say about death. Line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. That means that you should keep the context in mind when you study the plaques. Just like a building with a good foundation, make sure your conclusions are supported by all of the plaques with at least several good references for each point. Any other questions?
Well, if you could explain the traveling holy tent in relation to the last book of the plaques, and that would be a good place to start, and it would satisfy some of my curiosity.
Well, to be honest, the traveling holy tent is one of my favorite topics as far as research and importance. So, you're right. It is a great place to start.
Turning to Resident Resolve, Resident Leary nodded and smiled for the first time. Together they headed towards the Great Hall as the sun dipped below the wall behind them. They ambled in the door of the Great Hall and headed up the stairs. Upon reaching them, they disappeared into the stairs, talking cheerfully about the king and his plaques. Friday, 8 p.m., near the Gatehouse of Sight.
It's no fun being ill when you're not home. So it's nice to see familiar face, Resident Aspire.
I'm glad that you're feeling better, Alien Ponder. I talked to Junior Resident Hope just before she met you at the Gate of Hearing, so I did not know anything about you being in the castle.
Well, I do not know when I have ever been that sick.
Alien Ponder replied with a light cough.
Resident Hope took me to her room, and I fell asleep right away. I think I slept through pretty much the entire attack. At some point I heard pounding, but I assumed it was my head aching.
Well, it did not occur to any of us that Resident Hope would put you in her room, and since she was not here in the castle before or during the attack, there was no point in looking there. We had no way on knowing that Procure was really artifice, and we thought that you coming in sick and then disappearing were a ruse of the enemy to get his agents in the castle. Of course, when Head Inspector Cautious went to Victor Castle, he found out who the sick person was.
Well, I'm going to stay here for a little while, until I recover more fully. Besides that, I got to know you when you were Victor Castle, so I feel like I have a friend here.
You do, Alien Ponder, you do.
Friday, 8:20 p.m., near the fountain in the marble square.
The last 24 hours have certainly been a trial, although my trust in Creator King is unquestionably stronger than it was before.
Yes, Grace, our trust has certainly been rewarded.
Things have certainly changed in the castle. It seems almost like someone took a box with clutter in it and shook it all up with all the items on the inside falling into a sort of organized pattern.
Yes, the whole situation has concluded in a manner most favorable to Finite Castle, and yet we know that there is certainly a reason for it.
And what would that reason be?
Oh, hello, Avert.
Oh, hello, Avert. Grace and Perceive both said at the same time. Are you seriously asking that question?
Not really. I was curious to hear what she would say next. There's no neutral ground in my mind anymore. My remaining regret is that I don't know much about the plaques yet.
Well, since we have more time than we did during the attack, you will probably have more opportunities to read them now.
Grace replied.
That is curious. During the attack, when we were moving plaques from the Great Tower, there was one plaque I saw, and it raised an interesting question in my mind.
What was the plaque?
Well, at the moment, it is near the Gatehouse of Touch. I plan to meet someone there, and I will be heading in that direction soon. Anyways, that plaque says something about when a person dies, that they come up no more, and that they don't go back to their house again. I'm sure that is a misquote, though. It was a little confusing to me.
It seems plain enough to me. Why did it confuse you?
If I do not miss my guess, that would be the 18th book, Section 7 and Segments 9 and 10. That particular book does have some intriguing elements in it.
What confused me was that it seems to say something different than what the majority of castles and residents believe in regards to life after death.
The majority is often wrong, and from my experience, this has been the rule rather than the exception.
Yes, and as to the majority being wrong, remember that this is true only in the land of castles. If you include Theopolis in the equation, then the majority is always right. But as to death, to say that there is a lack of agreement in the land of castles about what happens to you after you die is something of an understatement. But the whole issue can be traced back to the third section in the first book of the plaques. Pernicious Accuser, who was in disguise, led the first two castles to disbelieve Creator King about death in reference to a very simple test of loyalty. Suffice it to say that Creator King said one thing, and Pernicious Accuser said another. Creator King said that death would be the price for failing a very simple test of loyalty, while the enemy of SoulCastles said that they would not die. And yet, the belief in life after death is what the majority of SoulCastles and residents subscribe to today. The lie of Pernicious Accuser was that you shall not die. In essence, calling Creator King a liar. But as to death, it is like sleep. When you go to sleep, you don't know anything until you wake up. The plaques show us that death is like sleep in this respect. This can be found in, among other places, in the 21st book of the plaques, section 9 and segment 5, which harmonizes with the plaque that is near your guard post. The plaques do not support the idea that there are presently people in hell, which, rather than being an event in a certain place, is actually an event in the future. The plaques do not support the idea that there are multitudes of SoulCastles presently in Theopolis. If someone is alert, alive, and aware, then these facts classify the person as living, not dead, regardless of where they are. Therefore, the idea that people are thinking and conscious after death is saluting the lie of Pernicious Accuser.
And really, this makes a lot of sense. Think about the idea of parents, supposedly in Theopolis, rather than sleeping in the grave where they really are, being able to see the suffering, pain, and sadness of their children who are still living in the land of castles. Worse yet, could someone bear the joys of Theopolis, knowing that someone they love who has died may be in torment, in what people conceive as hell? These ideas did not come from Creator King.
Well, if they're not in bliss or in torment, then what becomes of them?
Well, Avert, among other places in the second part of the plaques, Book 13, Segment 16, the plaques say that at the trumpet call of Creator King, the dead in him will rise first, which would mean that they had been in the grave since they died. And this, of course, is what the plaques teach us. In section 20 of the last book of the plaques, you can read that there are 2 times mentioned when dead people come back to life in mass. If Creator King raises SoulCastles back to life to take them to Theopolis, then they would have already been judged as worthy by the grace of Creator King to go there. They would not need judgment after they had already gone to Theopolis. Also, in the same section is the fact that those who go to Theopolis will judge the land of castles and those who lived in it, to show that Creator King has been just and righteous in his judgment. This will last 1,000 years. Then the rest of the dead will be raised for judgment and their sentence, especially Pernicious Accuser. It cannot be overstated how important it is to have a relationship with Creator King and be raised at the trumpet call of Creator King at the first resurrection. Was that a long enough answer for you?
Well, I guess that is straightforward enough, although it is certainly not in step with popular theory.
Very true. And whenever we run into anyone who may not agree with us, we should not compromise what we believe from the plaques for the sake of harmony. Line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little and there a little. This should be our watchword, or perhaps our watch phrase. We should guard the dignity of those who may not agree with us and be kind yet firm in our stated convictions.
As to death, it is comforting to know dying is not something to be afraid of when Creator King becomes everything to us.
How true that is, Grace.
Well, as interesting as this is, I need to get to my post soon. I'll have a lot to think about after this conversation. Good night.
Good night, Avert.
Good night, Avert. Who is he going to meet at the Gatehouse of Sight?
Someone with long hair.
Ah.
I hope that what I said about the plaques and life after death made sense.
It made sense to me, and from what I could tell, it made sense to him too.
Well, there is certainly something to be said for getting what we believe from the plaques.
Very true.
Junior Resident Genial and Resident Cloy were behind Resident Cloy's stand talking about bread. Junior Resident Genial was learning from Resident Cloy how to make bread, and they were also talking about the plaques.
Have you been to the room of plaques recently, Genial?
Yes, I have. Understanding the plaques has gotten easier since I have spent more time there recently.
Well, when you begin baking bread, you will see some similarity between baking bread and the effect of plaques have on you. When you put yeast in bread dough, then the heat causes the dough to rise, to change for the better. When you go to the room of plaques a lot, your character can also grow and change for the better.
I think that having a good character is one of the best things castles can hope for.
I can see that having a good character is very important to you. Your skill at making bread is increasing, and in the time you have been reading the plaques, I have noticed a change in you also.
I think that when our characters change for the better, there is nothing to be afraid of.
Well, hello there, Resident Cloy. Hello there, Genial. I can see that you are just about to close up shop.
Yes, I do not intend to keep selling bread after the sun sets, and I'm sure that Junior Resident Genial has other plans too. Besides that, I'm meeting Resident Albert soon.
Well, I should actually get going now. I have not been able to sleep much with all the noise of this attack, so I will say good night to you both.
Take some of this bread with you.
Oh, thank you, Legend Chloe. It'll make a good breakfast for me tomorrow morning. Good night.
Good night, then, Genial.
Sleep well.
Turning to Resident Cloy, Resident Presume went on.
I noticed that you never had your stand in the same place as Detroit and Artless. I can see one of them over there. Well, mostly anyways. I guess my eyesight isn't what it once was.
Yes, he's doing a lot of shivering and sneezing. Long before we found out that they were spies, I decided that if I wanted to sell any bread, I needed to have my stand in a place that was out of earshot of those two. If not for the sake of my sales, then for my sanity. All they ever did was argue. I never suspected that it was a ruse to make us believe that they were not working together.
Well, I did not suspect they were working together either, and it was certainly a shock. What I think was interesting was that Resident Perceive suspected them before there were any obvious clues that they were spies. I guess that is a good reason to study the plaques, although I know you have spent far more time there than most of the residents in this castle.
Well, some people have their hot drinks in the morning, and some people have their exercise. But I prefer starting the day in the room of plaques.
I think that I will take a page from your book in that respect.
It is a good idea, Resident Presume. The first 4 books in the second part are a good place to start.
Well, I have a guard post to go to, so I will say good night, Resident Cloy.
Here, take some of this leftover barley bread with you.
Ah, well, thank you very much. It sure has a good aroma. I can see Junior Resident Astute over there, and he is always hungry, so maybe I will go share some with him.
A fine idea. Good night, Resident Presume.
Good night, and thank you again, Resident Cloy.
Friday, 8:30 p.m. Near the guard tower of sight. Up on the wall near the tower of sight, Head Inspector Cautious leaned against the wall. Next to him was Alien Sharp. They conversed as they watched the inside of what was now Valiant Castle. Down in the castle, they could see people in the marble square. Resident Perceive was sitting next to Resident Grace. Below Head Inspector Cautious and Alien Sharp, next to the gate of sight, was Resident Aspire and Alien Ponder, while Junior Resident Astute sat on the fountain bench eating what looked like a fresh loaf of barley bread. A woman with blonde, curly hair sat next to the fountain, washing her baby's face in the fountain water as it cried.
It must have been quite a shock to come back here and find things so different than when you left.
Well, Alien Sharp, when I arrived back, it was a shock, but not one I was really surprised about. The attack did surprise me, but I was not surprised at the manner of the attack. I was, however, delighted to see that the enemy was defeated, and even happier to find some residents with sentiments that were opposites of sentiments they had bluntly expressed in the years, months, and days before the attack.
I am impressed. When I was here before, I always enjoyed it. But now it's like I'm on vacation.
Well, knowing what you were up against, I can't say I blame you.
Yes, since I am here for a short time, Junior Resident Surmise is left as the sole resident in Asunder Castle who trusts or even believes in the king. We have about 10 plaques, and that's all. As you can guess, there's not much for her and I to read.
You were recently promoted to a guard, right?
That is correct. Once I hit my mid-20s a week ago, I became a guard. So it's not as difficult as when I was a junior resident.
Do you still get a lot of opposition?
Well, Head Inspector, I do get harassed for reading the plaques, but everyone has accepted the fact that I will keep reading them regardless of what anyone says or does. It was really rough in the days after the attack, what with myself and Surmise being the only residents who had any interest in the plaques.
What exactly happened when your castle was defeated? Head Inspector Cautious asked. Oh, wait. Let me guess if I may. When you voiced your opposition to letting the invaders as you saw them inside the castle, you were booed and hollered down, correct?
Yes. I would often hear from other residents that they did not want to hear any comments. I still do not know who are spies and who are not, except for the guy who is always running the show. At any rate, before my castle gave in and welcomed that army in, this fellow suggested that we just let in one into our castle.
And I am guessing that popular favor was not on your side.
Yes, they let just one in. Someone everyone else claimed was a baker, but he looked like a soldier to me. Well, after they ate what he had, it was like they lost their minds. They opened the gates and let that army in. We were defeated, even though we only yielded just a little bit to temptation. While the rest of the residents of my castle were letting the army in, I went with Junior Resident Surmise to our great tower to read what plaques there were. I really wish we had more.
I believe I have told you about Mount Sacred before, right?
Yes, Inspector Cautious. I wish I could go there. Only I have no idea where it is.
Well, I know the direction, but that is all. However, there is a group going from Victor Castle soon, and they know the way. Some of the residents from here will go with them, and they would not mind if you went also. That way you could bring more plaques back to your castle.
Why, Head Inspector, that is the kindest invitation and the most welcome one I've ever heard. I'll definitely be going.
Well, I am glad to hear that, and I know that it will have a good impact on Asunder Castle.
Yes, Head Inspector, Luce does not believe in the king, but we do get on well, and that helps.
Well, I have some duties to finish. How long will you be around?
Oh, about 2 days or so. I came as soon as I heard the castle was spared defeat due to the Creator King. I like conversing with the residents here. I will especially like it since this castle was not defeated, but saved by the king. As you know, I sort of recuperate here after spending a lot of time in my own castle. But I should let you get about your duties. Thank you again for letting me stay here.
You are welcome. Enjoy your time.
See you later, Head Inspector Cautious.
Have a restful day, or rather night, Alien Sharp. Friday, 8:45 p.m. The shadows grew darker at a lazy pace as mist began to form around the walls of Valiant Castle. Resident Aspire was coming out of the Great Hall. He had seen Residents Resolve and Leary going into the room of plaques earlier. He stepped out of the door and began to head towards the stairs leading up to the Gatehouse of Sight. He suddenly stopped and turned around. Then, looking up, he saw a seal on the great tower of Finite Castle, which was identical to the one he had seen in Victor Castle. Looking up even higher, he noticed that a light was on in the quarters that had not been occupied for a very long time. He stood staring up for several minutes with a quiet smile.
Creator King, now the Lord of Valiant Castle. May you always be the Lord of this castle, Creator King.
Resident Aspire said.
We shall always be your faithful subjects.
He started to walk a little further and then stopped. Turning around again, he glanced back up at the seal and then up to the tower and back down again to the seal. He nodded his head and continued again towards the Gatehouse of Sight. He mused on all that had taken place.
As soon as I became a full resident, all of this began to happen,
he said quietly. Arriving at the top of the steps, he looked up. The sun was almost below the horizon now, and the twinkle of stars could be seen. Upon reaching the top, Resident Aspire saw that the moon was just rising in the opposite direction of the sun, over Mount Peril. He walked over to the Gatehouse of Sight and went in. Inspector Presume was there on guard duty, and they each bowed to each other. Good to see you, Aspire. Cautious is up those stairs.
Thank you, Inspector Presume.
Heading up the narrow stairs, he arrived at the top of the Gatehouse of Sight and stood next to Head Inspector Cautious. Head Inspector Cautious, glancing over at Resident Aspire, smiled and nodded his head. It is very peaceful, is it not, Aspire?
Yes, it is.
Resident Aspire replied, tilting his head to one side.
It is nice not to have the continually annoying boom boom outside the castle. I can actually think in complete sentences again. We have been snowed in with wares and philosophies from the enemy for years, but not attacked so abruptly and directly.
Yes, Aspire. The wares and philosophies were meant to corrupt us. But if they did not accomplish this, they were simply a precursor to war with pernicious accuser. We are in a war, one we cannot see with our eyes, but a war more real than what our eyes have ever beheld. The stakes are eternal, and the results of our choices everlasting.
It is interesting that castles trusting in the king are so brutally attacked by the enemy. Yet he does his utmost to deceive the inhabitants of the land of castle that there is no war.
Oh, you are correct. He would have us all believe that there is no war. To admit that there is a war is to concede that good and evil is in a raging battle over the choices and destinies of all SoulCastles. All people. The king encourages inspectors everywhere to know just what sort of wares they are admitting and why. He wants us to use the plaques to our full advantage, for protection, for comfort, and for acquiring a knowledge of himself. The plaques will also help us discern who are really wares and who are really spies when they come to our castle. The king asks all SoulCastles to stand by his side in this war against pernicious accuser. He asks us to choose life over death and truth over deception. His invitation to all SoulCastles, to all people, his creations is, come, stand by my side, witness the power of my salvation, witness the overthrow of evil, suffering, and death. We must trust the king and make good use of his plaques. Constructing a moat is definitely a priority now, and while I know we have many plaques, I would like to get more. According to my mentor, former Head Inspector Revere, there are enough plaques in Sacred Mountain beyond Mount Peril there to fill the entire Great Tower with plaques. As I remember, he said that Sacred Mountain has 66 caves with a wealth of plaques therein. Former Head Inspector Revere told me long ago that the journey there is riddled with detours, illusions, traps, hostile castles, and dangerous terrain.
Why is Mount Peril called Mount Peril?
Resident Aspire asked. because Mount Barrow also has a number of caves, so winding and long that many have become lost. There is the Cave of Worldly Media, the Cave of Lust, the Cave of Pride, to name a few. But for all who wish to avoid Mount Peril and its dangers, Mount Sacred is in reach of most castles. I suppose you want to go.
Well, yes, Head Inspector. As soon as we are able, let's get a group of residents to travel there.
As I told Alien Sharp earlier, there is a group from Victor Castle who will be going there soon, along with some residents from this castle too. And I think it would be good if you were in that group. Alien Sharp will be in that group heading to Mount Sacred also.
I saw Alien Sharp earlier. I had not actually met him before, but he seems like a nice fellow. He could use our petitions. From what he told me, he's up against a formidable group of residents who dislike the king as well as himself. He is probably the only truly diligent inspector there. I'm glad to be in a castle with so many diligent guards. Having our 5 gates always guarded sure gives me peace of mind, Head Inspector.
Resident Aspire commented. Yes, Aspire. Guard well the avenues of your soul castle and your mind.
I can see how accurate your words several days ago were.
Which words would those be?
You were agreeing with the inspector from Victor Castle who said that the size and strength of the wall of willpower did not matter. Those words were practically prophetic. We have been saved despite the work of the spies because, thanks to the strangers in white, we trusted the king rather than our walls, just like Victor Castle, and fortunately we had enough sense to keep the force outside. Outside, despite the fact that we saw different things outside. The walls helped, but it was the king who saved us.
Yes, even the so-called strength of our own walls can lead us astray if we trust in them and not the king. After this, I think that the residents of Finite Castle will understand that he is referred to as both Creator and Savior King.
It is a sobering thought, Head Inspector.
Yes, we also must see to it that inspectors at our 5 gates of sense scrutinize every where of the world that seeks entry, every philosophy, and may they be tested against the plaques. It is no secret that the plaques will prevent misery brought about by a castle being defeated.
I read something similar in that plaques myself. As I remember in the 19th book of the plaques, section 119, segment 11, it said, Your plaques have I hid in my towers, that I may not be defeated and sin against you.
Yes, Aspire. According to Book 59, Section 1, and segments 14 and 15, defeat begins inside of a castle. By the grace of the king, some of you saw an invading army. In an attack of temptation, defeat begins more on the inside due to spies and bad character traits that have snuck by careless and indifferent inspectors, and less because of a very real battering rams or catapults. When a castle is defeated, it is subjected more to its passions and less to integrity. In an attack of temptation, we must have the foresight and determination to subject our passions under us, and the plaques will show their great power to preserve a castle inside and out until it is rescued by Savior King.
It is war, Head Inspector, is it not? A matter of life and death.
Yes, very much so, Aspire. Never consult your feelings in a crisis. When you become a head inspector, during any crisis, use the plaques as the final decider. For if you do, they will lend their great power to your choices, and in them, through Savior King, pernicious accusers, so mighty a foe, will fail and fall.
And yet, Head Inspector, if we do not take the time to store the plaques in our castle towers and memories, they will not help us in times of attack.
Very true, Aspire. I look forward to getting more plaques. They are our lifeline in times of trouble. They can help us only if we have taken the trouble and accepted the privilege of trekking to Mount Sacred and storing them in our great tower. And what a difference they can make in our lives and in the attacks we face.
If our full trust is in the king, he will save us, even from ourselves.
Resident Aspire observed. Yes, Aspire, this is the battle of a minute and a lifetime. The question for SoulCastles and for people is simple. Who is the lord of your castle? The moon had risen, and the imprints of Resident Aspire and Head Inspector Cautious could be seen in their silhouettes. Any trace of the sun was hidden beyond the horizon. Side by side they stood, with Head Inspector Cautious resting his hand on Aspire's shoulder.
Head Inspector, it has been a long day for me. I think I will get some rest.
Yes, and I have some reports to collect. For once, I am looking forward to collecting dull reports. At that point, they each bowed and went down the stairs of the Tower of Sight, their shadows following them. Upon seeing Inspector Presume, they both nodded. He smiled and nodded back, but did not say anything. Upon reaching the wall, they both walked to the edge and looked over. Shaking hands, they parted, going in the opposite directions.
Head Inspector,
Resident Aspire said, turning around. Yes, Aspire?
I just want you to know that Valiant Castle will have a resident who will always use the plaques first, and trust the king no matter what, for a long time to come.
Thank you, Aspire. Your sentiments inspire great peace within me. I know that I can leave Valiant Castle in good hands. What is important is that you commit your hands, your heart, and your mind as well to the king. Ah, I think I see Resident Hope coming, Head Inspector Cautious said, turning to Resident Aspire with a knowing twinkle in his eyes.
I think you're right, Head Inspector.
Resident Aspire replied with a tired smile. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. Well, I shall say good night then, Aspire.
Thank you, Head Inspector. Good night.
With that, they wearily departed in opposite directions, casually glancing back at different times with smiles shaded by the meandering mist and pale light. Their shadows followed them in the light of the moon until they walked out of sight on the high walls in opposite directions. Slowly, the moon crept behind the great tower, creating a large, elegant silhouette. The night shadows veiled themselves behind trees in the forest, in streams, and mingled with the darkening mist surrounding the high walls of Valiant Castle.